This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken begins today's show as the pair talks about the value of the Ogallala Aquifer for agriculture and wildlife. Keeping the show rolling is K-State Extension cow-calf specialist Jason Warner as he discusses mineral supplementation and the factors that can influence what producers purchase. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends today's show with the negative effects of heat stress on dry cows and steps that can be taken to keep them cool. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. I think we've got a aquatics episode up this week. So, Joe, what do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I was at the Ogallala Aquifer Summit last week, and we talked about the aquifer, the importance of the aquifer. And so here we are. I thought we'd talk about the Ogallala Aquifer and its importance in Kansas.
I think probably the first thing that some of us need to know is what's an aquifer, Joe?
An aquifer, aquifers come in different shapes and sizes, just like surface water does. But basically, it's a source of underground water. So you can kind of think of it very loosely as a lake that's underground, right? And so it's not just a lake, it flows from one area to another, but to make it easy to conceptualize, it's kind of like a lake that's underground. And it's really important to us because that's where we can draw a lot of water to help us support life above ground.
How big is this aquifer that we're talking about?
Yeah, so the Ogallala Aquifer covers 8 states. So it's up north, Wyoming, South Dakota has little pockets there. It comes down Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, and then Oklahoma, a little bit of New Mexico, and the Texas Panhandle. So 8 different states. It's pretty big, and so the elevation, it can be pretty close to the surface, within 10 to 100 feet or so, all the way down to about 1,000 feet deep. And so, it's a big body of water. It's expansive, covering a lot of this region.
Why do we care about it?
Humans have been using the aquifer quite a bit, and starting in about the 1940s, we started to use it for agriculture. So irrigation of crops is the primary use, and about 90 to 95% of our use these days of this aquifer is for agriculture purposes, so row crops or livestock production, right? There are some other uses, so some small towns, for example, will use it for their drinking water source. That's where about that other 5 to 10% comes from. By far, most of it is coming, or we're using it for that agricultural purpose. We started using it in the 1940s, and we've seen depletion since then. So last 80 years, the amount of water in the aquifer has declined. That decline really took off in the early 2000s. So from 2001 to 2011, we used about a third as much of the water as was used from the entire time from 1940 to 2000.
Wow.
So a 10-year period, we used the same amount of water that was used over about a 20 or 30-year period previously. So that increased use, we started to get concerned about it, and there's bringing people together to figure out what can we do about it.
What kinds of things could we do to try and slow this loss of water from the aquifer?
Luckily, there's lots of things that we can do, and there's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of farmers and producers that have really taken this under their wing as something that they want to do and they want to help preserve the future of. And so examples are, you can make changes in feedlots, for example. So be more efficient at bringing in water and how you're losing water. There was an example at the summit where a producer was historically using 16 or 17 gallons of water per head per day, and he was able to lower that down closer to 11 gallons of water per head per day. And 5 gallons might not seem like much, but some of these lots can have 300,000 or so head of cattle on them at a time, and so reducing 5 gallons of water per day, that adds up pretty quickly to a large chunk of water. And so these producers are really doing a really good job at firsthand making some changes that can directly benefit the aquifer and the water levels in the aquifer.
What else could we do besides thinking about, being more efficient getting water to cattle?
One of the things we can do is be more efficient with irrigation too. And so, making sure that the water that we're applying in these areas is actually being utilized by the plants. One thing that ties really well into that is thinking about the soil, making sure that the water that is on that soil can infiltrate into the soil and be utilized by the plant is really important. So doing practices that can make the plant and microbial activity more supported is really important. And so things like planting cover crops in the winter to help bring up some nutrients and keep the microbial activity high, or thinking about different crops maybe. Some pasture cropping was brought up, and that's kind of where you go plant row crops in pasture, in grassland habitat, and they've shown that the return on that can be really high because the microbial activity, the soil is just such high good quality, right? So thinking about the soil, thinking about the actions that you're doing, keep doing what you're doing. A lot of these producers are already doing a good job of making small implemental changes. Down the road, if we keep going on this path, it might mean something like changing the types of crops that are grown in these habitats. But for now, a lot of the industry changes and a lot of the adaptations by the stakeholders seem to be working.
Is agriculture the only use from the aquifer, or are there other uses that might be depleting it somewhat as well?
About 90 to 95% of the water that's used is used for crops. So that tends to be where a lot of discussions go. But that remaining 5 to 10% is really important. So it might be the only drinking water source for an entire town, right? It might be a town of 500 or 1,000 people or less than that. It might be a small town. But those areas are what make these rural communities. And so there's a lot of importance thinking about these small towns that are dependent on this, and how do you balance that? How do you balance the need for being able to grow the crops? If we get rid of that, that's a huge loss. Right. But also if we get rid of these little towns that make rural America or Kansas what it is, that's a huge loss too. So figuring out the balance here. And then like I mentioned earlier, the food availability throughout the region or throughout the world could be lost if the Ogallala Aquifer went away. There's such a big production in these areas that depend on this aquifer. It'd be pretty catastrophic on multiple levels if we lost the aquifer. That's why we're talking about it and trying to do things to save it.
We're mainly talking about the human implications of loss of water from this aquifer. What about for the environment and for critters and that sort of thing?
Water is obviously important for wildlife, and that's why I thought this would be a good topic for us to discuss. It's important to think about it for the crops, but a lot of wetlands are found near this area, or marshes, other habitats that rely on water. And so making sure that we have enough water that can support the natural resources side of things is also really important. The food habitat availability, there's been studies looking at mule deer, for example, that show their nutritional health is dependent on the amount of water and the quality of the growth that occurs based on that amount of water. There's been studies looking at songbirds that say, hey, if you have enough water and you get the right types of plants growing, you're going to have more songbirds in an area. All this makes intuitive sense, right? But the science shows that, hey, water is important for these critters in these different areas. And so making sure that we have the right amounts of water that can also be used to benefit the animals in this conservation is important. And it also ties back to hunting and fishing opportunities. So if we're thinking about getting outdoors, I think a lot of us have known, is it a dry year or wet year? What are the habitat conditions like out there, right? And so that's important because a lot of these birds are migrating from long distances. They're going to find these pockets of water as an area to migrate to or to hold over or whatever. So conserving it is more than just the agricultural side of things. There's a big importance for conservation and natural resources.
So where do we go from here?
There's some big picture things that are occurring that they talked about at the summit. They're outside of our expertise, but things like rethinking insurance payouts. So right now, the insurance companies, their goal is to not lose any more money than they need to. So if they're going to pay something out, they still ask for the farmer to irrigate and document that. But if the crop's already largely lost, maybe we can stop using that water and figure out a way to still get the insurance agencies their money from some other group. There's some things going on there. Industry standards, so changing things like the way that we irrigate or the crops that we grow, the specific variety of a crop that we grow, thinking about no-tills or the pasture cropping we've talked about. There are a lot of big picture things that are going on. I think realizing that weather patterns are changing. These extreme heat days are going to increase, and extreme heat days are expected to increase somewhere around 58% by 2030. And each extreme heat day leads to a decrease in the crop yield, right? So rethinking the importance of the water and what we're doing about it, I think, is where I would start. And then we all need to come together. And so I think that figuring out how to all come together and not wait on someone else to make the change. Let's come together and start thinking about what we can do. A great example of that are LEMAs, which are local enhanced management area plans. And so these LEMAs have been developed in certain groundwater conservation districts in Kansas. And basically the stakeholders, the producers in these small areas come together along with some government officials and say, all right, what rules do we want to have in place? And it might be we have to reduce our groundwater usage. It might be we're going to have a different strategy for X, Y, or Z. It's up to these local entities to come up with this. But there are two groundwater districts in Kansas that came up with these LEMAs, and those are the only two areas in the state where we saw actually aquifer levels increase, groundwater and these aquifer levels on average increase. So doing things like that at the local level can make changes that are beneficial to the group, right? So I think thinking about strategies on a local scale, on a small scale, it can make a big difference, I guess, is the point there.
Well, Joe, I learned a lot on this deal. Thanks for bringing this to talk about today. Just as a reminder, if you've got something you'd like us to talk about, reach out to us. You can find our contact info on the wildlife.k-state.edu website. And if you have a minute, go on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. That's how other people are going to find the podcast. And we'll look forward to coming up with something to talk to you about next time. I have a feeling that it might have something to do with managing wildlife habitat in the Great Plains.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Tuesday show talking about mineral supplementation for cow-calf operations. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Shelby. Thanks for having me.
Jason, why are we wanting to talk about mineral supplementation right now?
It's always a great time to be thinking about mineral supplementation for cow herds, and certainly as we go into this time of year, many folks are going to be getting very close to turning cows out to grass if they're not already in the process of doing so, if there's moisture and plenty of forage available for folks to be able to do that. And so I think just taking the time now to just get a good game plan put together for what your mineral supplementation strategy is going to be, and that's only something that we know that it varies tremendously around the state and certainly is going to look different for each individual operation. But just taking the time now to think about what your program is going to be, look at what your needs are going to be, and assessing that, and just making sure that you've got a plan to source the product that you're going to need throughout the year. And also, too, it depends a little bit on what your overall goal and general purchasing plan would be. But for some producers, they may have the opportunity to pre-purchase or contract their needs for the year. And so if producers haven't done that yet, there still may be opportunities to have those conversations with their feed service providers and see if there's an opportunity to do that for them to pre-purchase or line up their needs for what they're going to need in advance. And for other producers that certainly just purchase the product that they need on a regular basis, it's always just a great opportunity and time to be thinking about having those conversations with your provider and making sure that they're going to have the product that you're going to need throughout the year, and that way it's ready for you.
And are there some health factors that cattle producers might want to take into account when they're figuring out what mineral they want to use?
One thing we want to think about is phosphorus levels in minerals, and that's really important when we think about just making sure that we meet those needs, because we know that phosphorus is very important for a wide variety of biological functions, and certainly is very important when we think about reproduction in a set of cows. And when we think about just mineral supplementation programs in general, phosphorus, because of the fact that it certainly contributes a fair amount of cost to an overall mineral supplementation program, just understanding what those levels are and really paying attention to that in your supplementation product is going to be really important as you go throughout the year. For spring calving cows, now going into the breeding season, most of the data from forage analyses would suggest that somewhere between a 6 to an 8% phosphorus mineral in a 4-ounce consumption product is going to be adequate to supply the needs for that cow going into, again, later stages of lactation and, of course, the breeding season. And then when we flip that around, we think about cows, if they calved last fall, if they're going to be weaned here pretty soon, or if they're not already weaned, going on to the same forage base, somewhere between a 3 to 4% phosphorus mineral in a 4-ounce consumption product would be adequate. And so just looking at those levels is good to do. And certainly, folks, if they have the opportunity to collect some forage samples from their pastures at a few points throughout the year, being able to collect that information and just have a good handle on what your phosphorus levels are showing in your pastures and your forage base, that information is always very helpful when looking at the type of product that you need to match your needs.
And is this really a time then for producers to take the time to read that label?
Oh, absolutely. Anytime you're working with products, we always want to make sure that folks are taking the time to read and follow and understand the label directions, particularly products that have medicated feed additives in them. It's always important to just make sure you understand what the concentration of the medicated ingredient or the medication is in that product and understand what the units are. That's really critical. Certainly when we think about minerals that contain products such as chlortetracycline, which is important or which is oftentimes used for controlling and preventing anaplasmosis in cow herds. In free choice mineral products, making sure that you understand what that label reads and making sure that you visit with your feed service provider and your veterinarian to ensure that you've got all the information needed on that VFD and you've got a product that's going to meet your needs. Just making sure that you're well aware of that. Always important to do, absolutely.
Is it important to also then make sure that mineral doesn't sit on their property for too long?
Well, one thing that we know that happens with increasing time is that the vitamins, and certainly most commercial supplements that are out there will have a vitamin component to them or will have supplemental vitamins added into the product as well. And we know that we can incur some oxidation or some loss with vitamins over time as those products age. And so how much loss that we're going to see there over the course of time is a function of storage. It's a function of heat and humidity. And so certainly, most manufacturers would recommend, not feeding product that's over about 6 months old. Certainly when you start storing products for over a year, that's something that you want to be cognizant of, is that knowing that at least in terms of the vitamin fortification that's in that product, it's going to be less than what it was when it was purchased. And so just trying to make sure that you're using product in a timely manner and you're avoiding carrying a lot of product over into the subsequent year is really important. And again, that goes back to having that conversation with your service provider and just making sure that you can get the right amount of product that you need for the given time so that you're not storing a lot of product unnecessarily more than what's needed. So keeping all those things in mind.
Jason, in your position, what are some things you often see being overlooked when it comes to mineral supplementation?
Well, one challenge that I certainly encounter and I know is very real for a lot of producers is just really getting a good handle on what consumption is on a product when it's put out for a set of cows. Free choice mineral intake varies tremendously from one set of cows to another and from one pasture to another, and certainly that's impacted by a lot of things. Things from a management standpoint that we think about, proximity of those feeders to the water source, what type of feeder that product is being put out in. Certainly when we think about the specific ingredients that are in a mineral product, those things are going to impact consumption. And so free choice mineral intake is really, really critical. And it's important to make sure that certainly when we've got products that are medicated, we want to make sure that we get enough consumption on that product on average so that we're on label requirements there to get the dosage of the medication that's prescribed. But at the same time, too, we also don't want to have underconsumption, and overconsumption we know is costly as well, too, right? And so it's really important that we take the time to just calculate out what the consumption is. Really encourage folks to take a proactive approach to recording how much product is being put out for a set of cows. Just make sure that you do a good job of annually tracking or every week tracking how much product is being consumed. And then the idea would be is that over the course of the year, you should be able to get a good running average calculated up of how much product those animals are consuming.
Jason, you mentioned over and under consumption, and how can that be really impactful to a producer's checkbook?
Well, certainly when you look at today's costs on products, if mineral is $25 to $30 a bag, and if a cow consumes on average about 2 bags a year, if you figure a quarter pound per head per day intake or a 4-ounce intake, well, then you're looking at anywhere from $35 to about $40 per cow per year, or $35 to $50 per cow per year in a mineral supplementation program. And so just understanding where that cost is really important, and that's why you always want to manage what your overall intake is, because all of a sudden if consumption on average throughout the year is 2 or 3 times what the recommended consumption should be, well, then your cost is going to be 2 to 3 times that initial price as well too. So if your mineral supplementation program on average, if it should cost you anywhere from $35 to maybe $50 per cow per year, all of a sudden now if it's $100 per cow per year, well, that additional $50 per cow per year is net cost that you should be able to save and have that cost somewhere else. So it's just important to understand what your magnitude of cost is there, and certainly for some folks that can add up a lot quicker than others, but $40 to $50 per cow per year is $40 to $50 per cow per year.
What are some changes you've seen when it comes to mineral supplementation?
I would say one of the most common things that has changed over the course of time is newer products that have become available, particularly with regards to trace minerals that are being provided in different sources. And so there's a lot of different sources, product sources of individual trace minerals. When we think about trace minerals, we're specifically thinking about zinc, copper, manganese, cobalt, and potentially selenium as well too. And so we have different forms of trace minerals such as oxides and sulfates, but then we also have more complex forms of trace minerals, and oftentimes those will contain either a protein or an amino acid that are bound to those trace minerals. And so the idea there is that those forms of trace minerals have an increased availability and ability to be absorbed by the animal when they're fed. There's also some different forms of minerals out there that are what we would call a hydroxy trace mineralized form. And generally speaking, when we look at those types of trace minerals that are more complex, generally speaking, what we see is we see an increase in absorption or availability to the animal, and cost generally goes up as well too. And so again, understanding the increase in cost and making sure that that's within a producer's budget is important. But then at the same time too, it's important to have that conversation with your provider and that you clearly understand what that product is intended to be used for. And if there's key or specific times throughout the year when that product should really be fed to a set of cows or to a cow herd, is important to understand as well too. So when we think about this time of year for cow herds that are going into the breeding season, we know that requirements are getting ready to peak when we get closer to peak lactation, and of course coinciding with the start of the breeding season. And so that's a time period where that might be an appropriate time to use a product like that. But again, it's understanding what the product is intended to be used for. Make sure you understand what the cost is going to be and making sure that that's within your budget. All those things are important to do.
That was K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Research shows that the effects of heat stress on dry cows are profound and significantly contribute to lower overall welfare, productivity, and profitability. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says calves are born earlier from heat stress, are about 10 pounds lighter versus animals that are cooled during the dry period, and even at 6 to 7 weeks are still shorter in length, have less stature, and weigh less.
Today, I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the calves that will be born during the summertime. You know, a lot of times we concentrate on heat stress abatement during the summer months, particularly for our lactating cows, but there's one group of animals that often is forgotten, and that's your dry cows. Today, I want to just let you know that calf development is very, very important during the dry period. So when we think about calf development, the fetus is growing exponentially during this time. Organs are maturing, their cells are differentiating, and we have cell hierarchy that is being established in the calf. All of these are very sensitive to temperature. So when our dry cows are heat stressed, that means that we're having some negative impacts on the developing calf. Across many experiments, they have looked into this in more detail. So here are some things that we can observe from those animals that are born to dams that were cooled versus those that were not cooled and experienced heat stress. One of the big things that we see is that the calves tend to be born earlier from heat-stressed animals, usually about 5 to 6 days. These animals are also typically lighter, about 10 pounds, versus animals that are cooled during the dry period. So as we look at this impact, it actually continues on through the life of the calf. Even at 6 to 7 weeks of age, the animals that came from heat-stressed dams still are smaller, oftentimes shorter in length, have less stature, and again, have less body weight. There's also some additional effects on their ability to adapt to immunity. When we look at immunoglobulin absorption of these animals that come from heat-stressed dams, generally it's about 10 to 20% reduced compared to those that are actually cooled. So, what other effects can we see? Well, they followed these calves through the development period and into lactation. One of the things they have looked at is actual lactation performance. And these animals that come from heat-stressed dams actually have less milk produced each of their first 3 lactations. So this is very, very significant. So we have a dry period that is only 60 days long in general. However, during this time, if these animals are heat-stressed, then their calves are smaller at birth. They also have some issues with developing their immune system, and they continue to be smaller and produce less milk through the first 3 lactations. So cooling your dry cows is very, very important, not only for the performance of that animal when she calves in, but also the performance of the calf that she is carrying, and that will impact your dairy for many years. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging you to consider dry cow cooling as a priority this summer.
Thanks, Mike. And while we have a moment, this reminder, students from across the country with an interest in the livestock industry and related careers can apply now for the Kansas State University Animal Sciences Leadership Academy, being held June 5th through the 8th on the Manhattan campus. The Academy is an intensive 4-day educational experience designed to enhance the leadership skills and animal science knowledge of students in 9th through 12th grades. Applications are due April 15th and can be found at asi.ksu.edu/KASLA. The Academy's goal is to develop young leaders within the livestock industry and prepare them for a successful future in this field. Again, for more information, visit asi.ksu.edu/KASLA. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.